So thank you very much. I'm going to bring my notes up so I don't forget what I was going to say. So welcome. Oh, I'm going to hide this too. There we go. So welcome to our history presentation this evening. My name is Katie Malinowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Tug Hill Commission. And the Commission, along with the Friends of the Black River and the Lewis County Chamber of Commerce, are honored to have our distinguished guests, Chief Carr and Professor Cowie, here tonight. Also, a big thank you to the South Lewis Central School District for allowing us use of the facility and for all the technical support. I also want to acknowledge Friends of the Black River member Heidi Lehman, who's here somewhere, who was really instrumental in making this happen, the original connection to Chief Carr, and a lot of work and conversations since then. Before I turn it over, because I'm not going to introduce them, they're going to introduce themselves, they're going to do a much better job than I, but a few housekeeping items. We have attendees in the audience and we have attendees on Zoom. Online. So we've got a couple things going here. Just a little safety exits, the front and the back. You've seen those when you came in. There's some restrooms off the hallway in the back. And we'll have a little time, I think, at the end for some questions and answers. If you're on Zoom, we'll have you chatting your questions and answers, and we'll repeat them here in the room. And with that, I will hand over the mic. Thank you.
Ani Atik Dodem Megasekwe Dishnakas Laurie Jaganash Noswin Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg Gima Hiawatha. Good evening, everyone. First, as always, we're taught to give thanks. And in my teachings, it is about thanking you for inviting us here, and thank you to Heidi and the Friends of the Black River for having us and allowing us to share some of our history with you and to just helping us feel welcome and friendly. And for that, we're grateful. And we also want to say that we do have, and Heidi has them somewhere, but we brought some history books from Hiawatha, a Hiawatha history book. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And actually, Chad's going to start with his part first. And then we'll move into a little bit about Hiawatha. I'm going to talk more about the Hiawatha history and Hiawatha present. And Chad will talk more about that Mississauga Nation piece. So I'm going to turn it over. And Chimigosh, thank you.
Hello, everyone. So before I go into introduce myself, I just want to acknowledge that we're also on the Onondaga territory, the traditional territory of the Oneida, who are the stewards of the area. As you can see from the outline of the presentation, we have a breakdown of how we're going to talk today. So introductions, what is the role of Chief and Council under the Indian Act? That might have been moved to the back. I have to double check. What is the Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg research role? That's a role that I'm also holding alongside teaching at the University of Toronto. Important agreements, treaties, and purchases that need to be looked at. A note on our language, as well as the history of Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg, and then looking at Hiawatha, the community that we're both from, and in relation to being people of the Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg Nation. With a conclusion, and then our contact information will also be down there for you to be able to jot down if you want to. There we go. So as mentioned, Gima Carr had introduced herself. Ani Bojo Chad and Dishnakas Pamitaashkodeyong Dujaba Montreal Megwadoda Atik Dodem. So for those listening, what I said was, hello, my name is Chad Cowie. I am from the Mississaugas of Bryce Lake. Hello, no, sorry, I did something to it, sorry. I'm from the Mississaugas of Bryce Lake. I am currently living near Montreal, moving back to our traditional territory, and I am a part of the Caribou clan. So this picture is both of us. It's actually an interesting picture. This is from when I was interviewing Gima Carr for the research work that I'm going to be talking with you. Gima Carr is one of over 60 people I've interviewed so far over the last 2.5 years regarding understanding our history and gathering that information, not only from knowledge holders, but elders and other key people in our communities who have experienced that we want to make sure to report. when it comes to relearning our understanding and history. So actually, Carr is going to go first. So it's okay. Yeah, sorry. So part 2 is going to be, what is the role of Chief and Council under the ADMAC? So I'm going to pass this back over to Carr.
This picture here is of our council. We were recently elected in 2023, February 2023. I have been on council for, I'm going into my 11th year as chief. I did 4 years from 2007 to 11, and then I'm going into my 6th year from 2017 to 2023. And this is our council. Beside me there is Councillor Louts, Councillor Wilson, Councillor Potash, Councillor Edwards, and Councillor Moore. We have 5 council members and myself as chief. And at this ceremony here, so we don't do I want to say, as I would call in Canada, municipal swearing in and pledging oath to we would now the king. We do a swearing in ceremony, a traditional one, where we sign our oath of office, and our oath, our pledge is to our citizens. It's to, we will do our best to work for you. And we all have blankets on, and it's called a blanket ceremony. And when we're given that blanket and we're wrapped in that blanket, it's that acknowledgement of that work that we have to do for our citizens and how we have to care for them, and that we've acknowledged that and we've wrapped ourselves in that care of our community and to take care of them. So that was the ceremony we held there. And our role as chief and council is, probably very similar to municipalities, where we go through the business of Hiawatha. So we deal with legislative, whether it be through Canada or Ontario. We deal with community issues that are ongoing. We have work that we do in regards to, some days I can say, boy, I could be a lawyer, and some days I'm a politician, and some days I'm a dog catcher. So it's we had actually our Williams Treaty settlement, and our Williams Treaties is made up of several First Nations, including Hiawatha. And it had been ongoing. It was the 1923 Williams Treaties. And it was where our hunting and fishing rights were taken. No other treaty before or any after had, they said their First Nations people gave up their hunting and fishing rights. And we know we wouldn't have done that, because that's our livelihood. That's how we feed our families. So we had been battling for, 90 years from when we signed the treaty, but for at least 30 to 40 years. My dad was our chief for 18 years. And I remember him battling it as a little girl and listening and hearing these stories and battling that treaty, whether we went through the court process or negotiations. So we finally settled it in 2018. And that piece of, we talk about the settlement was 1.1 billion between the 7 First Nations. And when I mentioned the dog, we were hearing some people tell stories and like, yeah, we can negotiate, our chiefs can negotiate $1.1 billion settlement agreements, but then they get a phone call saying, there's a dog in my yard. So that's part of, honestly, that's part of what we do as chief and council. But a lot of it is negotiation. I deal with settlements. I deal with treaty issues. I deal with legislation, and we all have our own portfolio. And we use our clan systems now. We're just starting to incorporate back to more of our traditional way of doing business, even though we're elected. And I should say a little bit about myself. I just introduced myself in my language, but I'm from 2 families in Hiawatha. My mom was a Potash and my dad was a Cowie. And on my mom's side, the Potash were the hereditary chiefs of our community until the Indian Act came in, and we went to the elected system. And from there, there were several Cowies who were chiefs of our community, including my dad, who was our chief for 18 years. I am married for 31 years. I have 3 children and 3 grandchildren, little loves of my life they are. And I love what I do. I'm proud of the role that I have and taking care of the work that needs to be done for citizens. But it was very limited through the Indian Act of the work. It took the control from that traditional system, those clan systems that we had where everybody had a vote. And the Indian Act took that piece and it incorporated a more, more patriarchic, the males were the chiefs in our traditionally, but it was the women behind them. It was the women who gave those advice and did that piece. So that was lost for a very long time. And then I'm actually our first elected female chief in our community. And that was in 2007. So not that long ago. And so we see now, as you see, more women chiefs. In Ontario, there's 132 First Nations, and we're starting to see more women become either on chief or council. So it's good to see that balance. We always talk about in our culture about balance of male, female, of anything that we do. And so it's good to have that there. And so part of our, I'm not going to go into detail of what we do, but that was just a really quick run. But when we talk about the Indian Act, it had taken all of those pieces and it controlled what we could do. So for instance, we were talking about voting. We couldn't vote until 1960. We, if we wanted to, our men who served in the wars, served for Canada, they were, unless they enfranchised, so basically saying they're not going to be Native or First Nation anymore, they weren't entitled to anything, where others were given land and benefits to fighting for Canada and the wars. There's we couldn't go to school except if they sent us to residential school. But if we wanted to go to college or university, we had to enfranchise. We couldn't leave the community without a note saying that we were going into town. So all these pieces where the way that Canada had controlled the First Nations people. And so, we talk about all that piece and how far we've come. It seems like we make little steps. I think of the things my dad was working on, and I'm working on those things like 30, 40 years later. And so we've made baby steps, but we have a long way to go. And part of our conversation was so entwined in Canadian legislation that I don't even know if they know how to get out of it, or to get how to work through this Indian Act and every other legislation that we're entwined in. But I'll stop there with that part. I know we've got lots more to talk about, but I will move it on.
So it's what Carr was saying. We'll touch a little bit more on some of this over the next few slides as well. So she gives a good background and a good introduction to points that I'm going to be bringing up as well. And I'll give a little bit more background on some of that as well. I need to make sure I get this right, please. Sorry. So part 3, I'm going to talk a bit about my role specifically as the Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg researcher. So in October of 2020, I got approached to come on and assist with doing the research work for the 6 communities that make up the Mississauga Nation. So those 6 communities come into existence from the 1820s on. They start off as villages being utilized and being worked with the New England Company. It was a Methodist organization because when we converted to Christianity in the 1820s, it was Methodism. So they helped set up 4 of our 6 communities into villages. And we chose to do that at the time. It was our way of, it was how we thought we should go about doing it at that time. It wasn't, that was forced. And we'll talk a bit more, I'll talk a bit more about how we start to see a change to things being forced rather than being elective and it being made to be that way without our decision or without our choices being considered for that or our voice. So regarding the research role, my job is to also provide support to the chiefs. So I have Dnaagdawenmag here, that is the plural word for chiefs, and the councils from the 6 communities. And part of that is also seeking information, nation and our communities and our peoples. Part of this also includes making sure that we are bringing in knowledge from our citizens from all 6 communities. This includes knowledge holders, elders, as I said, and other people of key positions that they've had in the community. So when we're talking about knowledge holders, this is where you can sometimes see the difference between elders. For sometimes elders are looked at by a specific age. Knowledge holders, there's not an age that is actually alongside of it. It's what you know and how much knowledge you have regards to something. So in our community, we have a young man who's a few years younger than me. He knows our territory. He knows what is originally from that territory, what came after colonization and contact, what was introduced, and how the land has changed. And pretty much in apocalypse, he's who you want around because he knows how to help keep things going. He is looked at as a knowledge holder because he has that knowledge. I don't. So it's important for me to be able to consider some of that stuff as well. And doing this research work includes making sure that those items, those interviews will be available for those generations to come, not only for us in the 6 communities to have access to it so we can learn, because as we'll find out, a lot of our history has been denied to us or kept from us. So it's been a process of rebuilding that history and also starting to realize that each of our communities are not the only Mississauga people that exist. I apologize as well. I'm naturally warm, so when it's a humid day, the summer is like this for me, so don't mind me schwitzing a little bit. In the fall of 2022, I was fortunate enough where I was able to have someone come on and help me with research assistant. The reason for that is because, as I said, I've done over 62 interviews. A lot of these are done over Zoom, so they're recorded because during COVID, there was restrictions. And I lived in Quebec. I wasn't allowed to even go to Ontario for a while. And again, with the communities being protective of our elders, it was very important that we were very careful with how we were doing that. But with these interviews, these interviews are usually 2 hours long to 3 hours long. It depends. So there's a lot of stuff to transcribe there. And on top of that, because I was located outside of our territory, it was very important that we had someone who was able to assist in our territory. So this is where Terry Lynn Chiblo comes in. She is part of the Bear Clan, and she's from our most northern community, Michi Saagiig First Nation. So she had been helping me from September until the spring so far, in regards to going over these documents. This includes those interviews, but also includes over 200 sources, such as the Castor Land Journal, to see what is said about us in those documents. So when we're talking about how we relearn our history, we need to consider things like the way we talk, the way we walk in life is to be in a good way. And with this, we can live the life Creator intended for us. How did we get here? Do you want to address that?
In creating this, what we talk about and part of this slide is we always talk about the good way or the good life, Binnoojiiyag, and how do we get here? How did we get to this place we are today? And we always talk, we need to know our past as anyone, right? You need to know your history. You need to know your past. How did we get to this specific spot of Hiawatha when we had all of from Northern Ontario to Southern Ontario as our traditional territory? What was our culture like? What was our traditions like? How did we live that good life? And part of it for us is to learn and teach our children. So when I grew up, we didn't have the cultural teachings, we didn't have the ceremonies, we didn't have our language. And now in our childcare center, now we have a language speaker. We have the language in the local school. We don't have a school in our community, but we have the language there. So part of this, of reaching back and reaching at our future goals and visions, to be able to touch on our past. And that's the part where Chad comes in and learning that research, and it all fits, right? We talk about that circle and it's all one, and it all comes together and goes around. And that's important for us, to live that good life, that Binnoojiiyag.
Okay, so when we start to try to dissect some of what we're looking at regarding this history, especially for looking at documents that exist. So we need to look at all treaties, agreements, and purchases that we have entered, and we've entered many. There's over 20 that we have signed between contact and specifically relationships with the British going forward. This isn't even including our relationships that exist with the French. A lot of that's not documented. One of the treaties that, or one of the agreement type of structures that we tend to see is the dish with the one spoon treaty. So this is one where there's sharing of certain things, not land per se, or passing over land between each other. But this is an agreement that you'll see come up with the Iroquois. But we also had them with the Sioux, we had them with the Cree. East Coast nations tend to have this type of agreement. So you'll see a lot of documentation that will talk about this, that it's one treaty, but only one, when I would argue it is a type of agreement. It is a type of treaty that has been entered by multiple nations on the East Coast for centuries. We also have to look at agreements we have with the Huron, because there is overlap with territory and us protecting one another, especially as allies against the Iroquois. And then also agreements in relation to our fellow Nishnaabeg. So when we talk about Anishinaabe, that is also Ojibwe. Ojibwe is like a loose confederacy, like the Iroquois. So you have many different nations that are part of that stretch over period or stretch over a large territory, which we'll show in a map in a little bit here. And then this also goes alongside that District of One Spoon Treaty and other agreements that we made, such as the Peace of Montreal that comes out, where we allow the Haudenosaunee to settle in our territory, especially after December's war comes to an end, with some of the disagreements and some of the areas that happen with that, but especially after the American Revolution. We have those members of the Iroquois who actually chose the British side. They had to leave this area, they had to leave these territories because of siding with the British. So the British needed to be able to get territory for their allies from down here, and they came to us for that. So when you hear about the Iroquois communities that exist in Ontario, majority of them come from settlements with our nation, and us allowing for the purchase of land by the Crown to be able to have the Crown passed over to their Iroquois allies. So alongside this also goes Gusmantas, which are wampum belts, and how they relate to our history, but also the overall Confederacy of the Anishinaabe in general. These documents are very important for not only understanding how we did relations with the British, but also how some stuff was done in regards to Americans, especially during the War of 1812, as we're finding out a little bit more going on that. I found out some stuff today that was interesting, but also how we worked with other nations and confederacies, because obviously our diplomacy, our governance structures, our relations predate Europeans coming here. We had complex governance structures that existed long before. One of the other aspects for the research is our language. I was a part of one of the first group of kids in our community who started to relearn it, but Michi Saagiig dialect it's Anishinaabe one, it's Ojibwe, but it is a specific dialect of it. You also have Odawa, you have also Chippewa. There's a few of them. So when I started learning it, we had someone who was Odawa teach us. So if I go to our nearest community and listen to them talk, I can pick up what they're saying, but I don't have the same dialect as what my great-grandparents would have spoken, or vice versa. Again, it's an example of colonization, the schools. We didn't know that there was a difference in the dialect when we started bringing it back. We're starting to see that rectified today. So going over these documents and why some of these firsthand accounts, some of the things that have been reported by people in their diaries is very important, is because we're able to pick up some of our actual words that have been written. So I've been tasked with keeping a record of this, and it's a work in progress. So as I go over documents, a word comes up, I keep track of it. So there's a list of general words, there's a list of important names and ways that we describe people, and then also place names. So I'll give an example of this. When we talk about the word for French people in our language, when we first met French people, it was the Jesuits. They had big crosses. So our word translated loosely as people with big crosses. When we met Germans, it was during World War I. They were prisoners of war. They were starving, begging for food. So our word for Germans was people who were always hungry. I'm still trying to understand our word for Americans are people with the long knives. And I'm sure that relates to the 7 Years' War and the Revolution. But I haven't gotten concrete proof of that, but I've seen that documented in a few things. and even talking to some elders from some of the communities who have that knowledge and from their parents, they've used the word as well. So those are the three categories that I've been keeping track so far. And here's an example of both lines. Yeah, I just recently finished a book that actually gives the Ojibwe word for Americans. But you can see it's people. It's Big Knife Country, the United States of America, and people of the Big Knives, Americans, which is an individual's nationality side. So I need to update that one now that I have the word. So when breaking down and going over this history over the last 2.5 years with different reports that I've had to do, this is how I've kind of looked at it throughout my approach, especially as I'm reintroduced to our history and I'm reintroduced to understand even more about our families. This happens to me when I'm teaching classes too, so what I'm going to go over next is just some key examples of stuff. So when we're talking about this history, I can't give you all the history. I do a whole class for a whole semester on Mississauga Nation governance and relations, so we don't have 4 months, I'm sorry. But I do have the ability to go over some of this stuff before passing over to Carr in regards to the part that she's going to talk about at the end here in regards to Hiawatha, our history, and us today. So I'm going to highlight it quickly about regarding the Michi Saagiig representation of government, what our government structures were like before, our clan system, law, justice, and existence. We're going to talk a little bit about gendered and two-spirit roles, because as was mentioned about how women are looked at, there's an important component there that exists with our governance structures and our societal structures. And then I'm going to talk about what we call carrying places. These are very major important thoroughfares along rivers. So Toronto, there was one in Toronto and there was one in Scugog. And then when we talk about diplomacy, it's not only relations with other nations, but you see a lot of documentation about gifts. And it's not that we're giving gifts in the sense of that we are subordinate, but gifts are a part of our way of diplomacy. It's a way of remembering and having a story to go alongside retelling our original agreements that we have with other nations. We did it with other Indigenous nations, and we did it with the British and the French as well. Then we kind of start to get into some discussion here where we'll probably be able to relate a bit onto the American side is the Beaver Wars, because this is a war that we fought with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois. And then our period of encroachment period, which happens to start at the end of when, you guys leave the United Kingdom, you guys leave the British. And then we're going to talk a bit about our churches and how the churches have come into play. And then around 1840, you start to see even more of a drastic change with how Canada, or the predecessor to Canada, colonies, look at Indigenous people and how we've become more of an issue of being in the way of progress rather than just being allies and nation-to-nation relations. And that's where we will continue on with a little bit of example of correspondence, showing exactly what Carr talked about. We have always stated the same things over and over, that the treaties, our agreements are not being honored, and you can see documentation going back to this period of time as well. Thanks. And then with the last part, we'll talk a bit about how Canadian settler colonialism plays into a lot of dismembering and kind of deconstructing our nationhood, because where our traditional territory is one of the economic driven engines of Canada. You have Toronto, can't put a price on Toronto for the financial district. It would be like trying to do that with New York City. Oh yes, there's a lot of writing here, I'm sorry. Academic again. I've also been writing about this for my dissertation a bit. So regarding the Michi Saagiig, when we're talking about them, we need to look at them as coastal people. By that I mean at the mouths of rivers along the Great Lakes, especially along Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and Lake Huron. And the reason for this is because we would make camp at the mouths of rivers because our key point was we were fisher people. We fished. Salmon was very important to us. And that is what we focused on going through that. But there's also trapping of beaver, harvesting sap, to name but 3 items. These were very important. And I can't go into details about these because obviously in regards to sap, we're talking about maple syrup, but there's a whole process. Most families had their own little area where they would go and do that in the spring, as well as when they would go do harvesting of rice in the fall. And the fishing specifically would be at the spawning season of either the spring or fall. And it's interesting with that because when you look at the spring and fall period, and we would be at the mouths of rivers. British representatives knew that that's where we would be. So most of our original land surrender agreements are signed during those specific months. So you'll see it in May, October, November, May, and June. So our territory stretches across much of present-day southern and central Ontario. And I'll show you a map here in a minute to be able to highlight that. But we shared territory with other nations, specifically our confederacy. But when we're talking about our territory, and this is kind of an issue that comes up in the Western structure of looking at boundaries, unlike the United States and Canada border, a lot of our territory blended. So there's territory we shared with each other. So it's more, there'd be a gray area where it would be shared territory between nations and other confederacies that you would have as kind of a neutral zone that would be shared going back and forth. Because again, when we talk about land from an Indigenous perspective, Michi Saagiig perspective, is you can't own it. It's alive. It's a living thing. It needs us. I mean, we need it, not it needing us. So we are there to take care of it. So you can't really own it. Because of this, we can see other things that come up, especially with regards to how history has been written about our traditional territory. So when you look back to when Europeans started exploring the area, the French came into our territory. And when they came down with them, they brought disease. And it hit the Huron pretty hard in Northern Ontario. Our oral history talks about us allowing them to come live amongst us because we're protecting them from the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois. They had been being attacked a lot, especially in their traditional territory on the south side. Think more towards Ohio is where they originally were coming from. And we allowed them to come up into our territory. But when the diseases came, it hit them really hard because we moved a lot more, especially along the waterways. We moved further up north to avoid the diseases. But a lot of that history that's been written by French talk about it being Huron territory. And if you look at old maps, it calls Southern Ontario Huronia. So there's questions about that because they weren't obviously able to talk to us because we would move. When the British come, there's an old world feud between the French and English. So of course, there's already a feud here in the New World between the French and the Mohawk and the other Iroquois nations. So automatically in line with the Iroquois, they write about the Iroquois. And so there's a lot of discrepancies there. So our nation is not reported very well. We're not talked to very much during this period of time. Because as you start to see documentation and we start to see writing about, there not being that many people who live in the area. Well, disease has hit. A lot of people died from the disease. We moved out to our northern part of our territory to avoid that, and then came back down as it subsided again. So this is important on the Canadian side because when it comes to recognition and territorial recognition and land claims now, and even rights to being able to hunt and harvest and fish, there's a way that we have to be able to prove territory. And in a lot of cases, there's looking at what the French and the English wrote and not necessarily listen to our oral history, despite the fact that they're supposed to listen to that in our report or Canadians report. Alongside this, you see a lot of trading, not just with the British and French, but prior to that as well. There is a burial ground that we take care of called Super Mounds, like that in Ohio. You will find shells from Mexico there. And this is dating back 1,000 years prior to contact. So we had a very robust trading network. And there are oral history stories that talk about that. So again, where the Huron, because they settled long-term for 10 to 15 years, they would grow tobacco, they would grow corn, we would trade them fish, they would give us corn and other pottery. So although there's a lot of Huron pottery in our area, there's questions about how much that was actually traded with us and given to us based on what we gave them. Of course, today, as highlighted, we're down to 6, we're put into 6 communities. You have Alderville, which originally, all the people from Alderville originally come from near Kingston, Ontario. That's where their original area was. They are moved to Grape Island in the 1830s before moving to the current location in the 1840s. They are on the south side of Rice Lake. We are on the north shore of Rice Lake. Curve Lake is another half an hour north on Mud Lake or Curve Lake. Out of Curve Lake, you see Scugog Island eventually form. Another 10 years later, Scugog Island forms in what is called Balsam Lake before they move to their current location. And then way up north, you have Mississauga 8 or Michi First Nation. So when we talk about representation in government, We're part of the Anishinaabe Confederacy. This is composed of Algonquin, Mississauga, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Chippewa. The focus still looks favorably to the nation's autonomy and confederacy. So we're part of a group we come together, especially at times of need, concern, war. But a lot of autonomy still exists within each of those areas and within each nation and within each subgroup within that, or within each sub-community, you could say. Issues of international relations are therefore dealt through the Confederacy. And there is some documentation that talks about how the Mississauga specifically are referenced as holding the role of diplomats. Because if you look at where our territory is, we're in the middle of the Anishinaabe territory, and we are the buffer with the Haudenosaunee to the south. And again, there's a map for me to show you that part. Our government was done in consensus style. And when we talk about this, we talk about voting, how it's done now. Our consensus style included everyone. You had young, old, you had male, female, everyone's opinions were included and brought to a table if they needed to, and thoughts and decisions and thoughts on decisions were put forth, and decisions usually came to a middle ground to make sure everyone is included. And as Carr was saying, chiefs are traditionally hereditarily male, but that does not mean that there is not checks and balances. And it does not mean that just because you were born from a chief, so if your father was a chief, doesn't mean you necessarily get to be a chief. If you're not qualified, or if you are not in the right mind to be able to hold that position, if you cannot uphold Binnoojiiyag, you can get ousted. But, yeah. So there was checks and balances for that. So there was no absolute rule when we talk about this. And here's the map. So it looks like it ends over here where you can see the number 42, but it actually goes further than that because it doesn't fully include the Algonquin, which is most of Western Quebec. But you can see what a lot of the Anishinaabe territory is. And they list it as Plains Ojibwe and all that. Again, Ojibwe is the English version of French version that actually refers to Anishinaabe. So it gets mistranslated for a while. And again, with Anishinaabe, you have Mississauga or Michi Saagiig, you have Chippewa or Chippewa, you have Potawatomi, you have Odawa, you have Algonquin. So as someone who lives in Quebec at the moment, my favorite time is, especially when things about Quebec separation. They tell me I have no right to speak. I say, yes, I do, because Western Quebec is part of my confederacy. They don't like that. So. But you can see the strong part of our territory. We cross over 4 provinces, and then we also cross into the United States. And so when we're talking about that border that exists between Canada and the United States, that border comes after and is imposed over top of us and causes division amongst our nation, our confederacy as well. And then, like the states, we have different provincial jurisdictions that play into, which causes more complications as well. So as looking at that map, obviously to the south, we have the Haudenosaunee. To the west, or to the east, we have the Wabanaki, or those members of the Wabanaki Confederacy, like the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet. We have the Cree to the north, then we have other Cree to the west, and Sioux to an extent to the southwest. So when we're talking about that, this is where the diplomacy comes in, those treaties. But alongside of that, there's constantly documentation showing that, we give gifts, and gifts are given to us at ceremonies. British documents show this, and it's as if that is a way of paying or keeping us calm and keeping us happy in a sense, and not therefore what they would call, practicing civil disobedience. So items could be clothing, bullets, and twine. But the gifts are assigned more so from the Indigenous perspective. And if you want to, you can look at some writings by Leanne Simpson, another Mississauga academic. She talks about these as well, and she highlights how these gifts are done. There's quite a few writings that have been done on this, but they are about renewing agreements that exist. They are about relationships and about those treaties that have been signed, whether they're between nations or between the British and the French when they come over, or even with the Canadian state. And there's actually some documentation on this side as well that shows that was done here as well. It is important for considering this and understanding and reflecting not only our relationships with the British and French and other European nations, but also other Indigenous nations, Indigenous confederacies, especially the Haudenosaunee. I keep relating to them. We're in Haudenosaunee territory, but our history has not always been one of friendship going back a long time ago. So we're talking about gifts. They're part of that agreement. and can be symbolic. They can be symbolic because you have to sit down, and alongside those gifts, there's conversation. And we see this in 1860, and you'll see some documentation. So in 1860, the Prince of Wales, who becomes King Edward VII, comes and visits most of what is the Canadian colonies or the Atlantic colonies and Canada, and then actually comes down to the United States to do a bit of a tour. He visits our community of Hiawatha First Nation. It's actually one of the ways we get our name, Hiawatha First Nation. So upon coming there's documentation by his doctor that gifts were given to him, baskets, things made with porcupine quills, and they're handed over by a woman that has a last name Pamitaashkodeyong, but not much is explained about that. Who fully made the gifts is not fully discussed, and not much is looked at it. It's looked at as being given to the king because he is the sovereign. For us, it is renewing and reminding him about our relationships dating back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, as well as the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. I bring that up because our longstanding relationship with the British starts as allies and friends after the 7 Years' War. We were allied with the French. The Dnaagdawenmag, the saga, we fought on behalf of the French. The French lose, Treaty of Paris is signed. They eventually decide they agree to leave and give over their colony of Quebec. The British thought that meant that we would stop fighting because we would have to subjugate because the French did. But again, that was looked at as if we were controlled by the French, not as if we were allies and nations who fought alongside them. So they realized that they had to formulate another agreement. And in the summer of 1764, over 2 months, with over 40 different chiefs and other representatives, so I think over 2,000 people attended, and it was over 28 different nations met here, and some of them coming as far as the prairies to have this 2-month meeting to be able to situate how that relationship is supposed to be nation to nation. There are 3 belts that are given. The belts highlight various points about how going forward, it's going to be a relationship of friendship and allyship, not one of subjugation. And they're supposed to move forward together and respect one another. And at this point, there are gifts that are given as well from both, but only the gifts that are given by the British are documented. I guarantee you that we gave gifts as well, and there's oral history that talks about that, but those aren't documented. What was given from us is not really focused on. This goes on for a couple of years after this. For a few years after this, we meet again every year in this area. It would be reminded, gifts would be given again. And what was done in 1764 is we discussed how we renew our relationships, how we renew our diplomacy. This eventually stopped unilaterally by the British in the 1830s. But they are very important for understanding, especially how when we move forward. And we're talking about this, and when people say, we had an oral history, how can you keep track of stuff? Well, we had ways of being able to retell it. And it was part of our diplomacy and part of our way of governing. Another part of our government is our clan system. So there is debate currently over the last couple of hundred years. Yes, it has been passed through our father. There are people who argue that at one time it came from our mother and we switched over to it from our father. I have heard from some elders and some sources that when your father is not Ojibwe or not Mississauga, you inherit your mother's. Part of that is to make sure that the line, that the clans continue to exist. They still run and they don't slowly fall apart or disappear. So in the cases where your father might not be Ojibwe, you would inherit your mom's. But if your father was Ojibwe, you inherited his. And it's kind of interesting with that because we look at Carr, for instance, she's the same clan as I am because we're on the same family side. But she comes from hereditary chief on the Pamitaashkodeyong side, but then on the other side, our clan is also part of the ones that help take care of our community, but also with education. So there's an interesting point there about how we still live our clans today without realizing that connection has always been there. So when we talk about these plans, you can look at them as state departments. You can look at them as what we would call ministries in Canada. So there would be healthcare. It would be the Ministry of Health. You have the Eagle Clan, which would be the Prime Minister's office. It was the one where I think we're focused. The Crane would be the Secretary of State. It would be that. Education would fall under Caribou. And so on like that. So when you're looking at these clans, there is a part of it that is recognized, and how an elder explained to me was that it's connected as we want to look at it in the Western structure. You can relate it to ministries and departments that exist. they had rules. And each reflected an animal or non-animal, because we have seen documentations that show white birch or white porcupine, or this one at the very bottom, for instance, is a plant. These are Dodems, these are clan system or clan documents and signatures from Caribou First Nation specifically. When doing these comparisons, like I said, to relate them to the bureaucracies or government departments that exist, but they're not set in stone. So you may be born into them, but that does not mean you can't ask to be adopted into a different one. Or if you have if you've not been able to find out what your plan is because of the history and it being denied to you, you can still ask to be adopted into one as well. Obviously, you don't marry your clan because that clan is like your family. You have to marry to a different one. These were important for how our structures worked and how not only our governance worked, but also our societal structures worked as well. And that was a big part of, again, when we talk about marrying in and out. So when we talk about law and justice and existence, so we're talking about citizenship, the idea of blood quantum, the idea of having to have the DNA connection that is introduced, that is given to us, forced onto us. Because as the Canadian government comes into existence, we're not disappearing quickly enough for some things. So they start to put in legislation that controls us. So my number is 162-004-6601. That's my number that says I'm an Indian under the Indian Act, Section 27, Canadian law. We didn't agree to that. That was imposed on us. And technically, by that, I have to marry a Native woman. I want my kids to have status. There's a lot wrong with that, obviously. Originally, how it would work, say Heidi and I had decided to marry, and she's not Ojibwe. She could become part of the Mississauga Nation by following our tenets and our rules. As long as she followed the rules of Binnoojiiyag, she looked after the community, she could be adopted. Laurie's husband, who is not a member of the community technically, but is in many ways part of it, could be adopted in. It didn't matter if you're male or female. You could be adopted in, as we did with children, and as we did with other people who we found who might have lost their communities or absorbed into it. You could still be a part of it. It wasn't just about blood. It was about connection, kinship, outside of DNA. We talk about restorative justice or our system. If something bad is done, especially to who it has harmed, you have to listen, you have to hear what you've done to them in a way to be able to move forward. So instead of penalizing or getting rid of someone or shunning them, that person has a chance to rehabilitate, but they have to listen to the people that they harmed and work with them to make sure they can do better. When we're thinking about how we're making decisions going forward, we're not just thinking about our path, because in order for us to move forward, we need to know where we came from. In order to go down a good path, we need to make sure we're not going to make the same mistakes in the path. But it's also to think of those 7 generations to come. So when we're making decisions, we have to think about those future generations that are not here yet. It's not just about us today in the present world. It's about those that are still to come, to make sure that they are not in a bad situation, or again, our mistakes from the past are not there to haunt them in the future. So this all exists alongside relationship building, which again relates to our diplomacy, which relates to how we go about building our international relations and nation-to-nation relations as well. Alongside this as well is the place of our women and two-spirited people in our societies. So again, there's not a lot of discussion that exists in regards to this. And when you look at some of the history here, women are kind of put to the side. There's not a lot of focus on it. Focus tends to exist on men. And with that, that's okay to an extent. But again, as Carr is talking about our structures, there's very important parts to do with females in that were really important to understand, especially with how communities worked, how communities went forward, what was done within the villages, as well as the fact that, again, there's still final decisions that were made through clan systems that required the inclusion of those who were involved. It wasn't just men who were in control of those clans. It was obviously everyone who was involved with it. So if you want to, again, Leanne Simpson talks about a bit about both of these, and so does Doug Williams' book, Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg. It is a good book. It is a history from the Curve Lake First Nation area, but it talks about all of us as a nation. It's a really good book, and I do strongly suggest that as another one to look at. And alongside this, a lot of my interviews have talked about this and have brought these two subjects up as well. When we're talking about two-spirited, in the Western sense, that's referring to LGBT people. Their place in our society was important because they were able to be fluid. They had that ability to cross between both sides. They were our educators. They were our spiritual people. They were our healers, our doctors. So at the onslaught of colonization, these people are key people in our societies. We lose them because of the disease. We lose them as other things encroach and tell us that it's wrong. So this is a key component with these being lost and the place of women being lost. We start to see a hard time discussing and understanding our own original structures of society, especially as disease, alcoholism become rampant in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The importance and significance of women in our societies was diluted, made de facto illegal to have the roles and control that they had prior to European encroachment. They were looked at as being too strong-willed. They were looked at as causing problems because they would interfere with when we were trying to do diplomacy. Again, they had a right to be involved in our system, but the way it's written by a lot of British people, British writers who were documented this time, is that they were causing problems and getting in the way of the men doing their work. And again, even with regards to women, as I said, there's discussion about this. There are some people in interviews and documents that show it comes through the wife or comes through the mother at one time. And that again, when the father is not Ojibwe, you would still inherit your mothers. There's questions about the idea that if it's solely just through the father, if that's because of the influence from the church and the influence from colonization and trying to, again, get rid of the place of women and their structures within our societies. And how much that might have influenced it. So again, we do approach it through our fathers, but in the cases where our father is not, it has been argued that it could come from our mother still. In regards to carrying places, as I mentioned, these are routes where we would do our trade. So it wasn't just used by us, other nations use them as well. The Toronto carrying place is one of the key ones. Scugog is another important one. These are maps. I'm still learning more about them, but where our community is along the Trans Severn Waterway. That was a carrying place at one time as well. That gets turned into a lock and a very much thoroughfare to get further into the land or further inland from Lake Ontario. But again, there's more knowledge that needs to be done here, and a lot of the territory has changed since original documentation and original writings of these carrying places existed. So I'm still waiting to be able to see more documents and go over stuff, especially with me moving to Toronto. Because when I started looking at these, I was restricted to what I could see and where I could go because of COVID. So this photo here is the Treaty of Niagara. This is the 1764 belt. And again, it's showing that nation-to-nation relationship. You can see 1764 in this. This is a replica of it. But you see two people in the middle holding hands. One represents the British, the other one represents the Indigenous people on the other side. So we could say that it represents the white people and the red people. It's a way of trying to show friendship moving forward together as allies and as friends. This picture was just taken earlier in July in the Isle of Man. I was a part of a delegation that got to go over on behalf of the Mississauga Nation to meet the King and to meet other government officials in the UK. And so we were presenting at the Isle of Man on this. This is Councillor Steve Toms from Curve Lake. So again, when we're talking about this, the other one that I want to focus on is the Haudenosaunee and Huron. And the reason why I want to focus on them is because it's interesting. We have that long history that exists with the Haudenosaunee. There's conflict there, and of sharing territory with them as well as with the Huron. What is interesting from this picture is the stone memorial is from the Battle of the Thames River from the War of 1812 and 1813. And it's at the location where Indigenous nations met together to plan how they were going to assist the British as allies. It was the last time until 2021, right? No, 2022? No, 2021. November of 2021, we met with representatives from the Huron Nation for the first time as nation to nation since 1813. So it's been over 200 years since we had actually met nation to nation instead of through Indian Act or through Indian Affairs or at the Assembly of First Nations. And it was to deal with some of these issues that exist with overlapping territory and burial grounds that exist, because they do have ancestors that are buried in our territory. So it was a good meeting. So this is another historic moment, showing that relationship, reliving and remembering that original relationship and friendship that we had, while starting to look for a way forward, nation to nation. And that alliance that existed between them for centuries. When I talk about the Haudenosaunee, a key component that we need to talk about is related to the Beaver Wars. This is a period in a war that goes on for much of the 1600s. As settlers are coming in to the colonies, the 13 colonies, especially New York, the Haudenosaunee start looking for more beaver pelts because it is financially viable for them to be able to sell those to British settlers. And so they start coming over to our territory. And at this time, again, we have moved to the northern part of our territory because of disease. And they have encroached into the northern shore of Lake Ontario to be able to get that beaver, to be able to get those pelts, to be able to sell back. We were not happy with that, so we came back to push them back. And there is a long-standing war that goes on almost for the entire century. And this is when you start to see some documentation from the British as well, as allies of the Haudenosaunee, documenting from their perspective of this. But you see this important period where there is an ongoing war, and there are various burial grounds and burial sites that exist along the pathway coming down from up near Manitoba Island, where you see the road back into pushing them across the south shore. They came over to the north side to be able to collect those pelts. We pushed them back alongside. And we seem to see some kind of agreement coming to a close by 1701 with the treaty of, or with the peace of Montreal in 1701. But there's still questions about that because we see addition of the Spoon Treaty come into place here. And so on the Haudenosaunee side, they say that meant we agreed to share land with them. Well, from our perspective, it has been sharing some resources with them. So you start to see also butting of heads over territory between the two different confederacies going forward from here. So our original relationship, again, old world alliances or enemies, spreads over and goes alongside new world enemies that have already existed in alliances that exist. So the French and our nation aligned very quickly together, while the British and the Iroquois aligned pretty quickly together. So they find people who are compatible who don't get along with the same people. So it's been interesting looking at that history. As time goes on, especially as we see there's a threat or considered a threat from the French colony of Quebec towards the 13 colonies down here. There's a push for the British to declare war on France and take it away. We had the 7 Years' War. And I use, from the Indigenous perspective, when I say this, it's looked at as a settler rebellion from 1775 on. Again, if I'm using 1775, blame my North American, British, Canadian education. But we look at it as it's a rebellion because that's their traditional territory, or for the Haudenosaunee, it's their traditional territory. But after the revolution comes to an end, loyalists move up to the state or move up to the British colonies in the north. The British need territory for those loyalists who are coming up. So they put into practice the Royal Proclamation. It agrees that in order to be able to obtain territory from Indigenous nations, you have to enter a treaty. It has to be done on behalf of the Crown. You can't do it yourself as an individual. It has to be done through the Crown. But what we don't learn about and what we don't see written about a lot is that other part of this agreement. So the Royal Proclamation in regards to Indigenous nations and not molesting and taking land unilaterally without the Crown agreeing to it is only half of that story. The treaties of Niagara talk about what that relationship is actually supposed to look like, that nation-to-nation relationship, where it's not about subjugation, it's about allies and working together as equal nations. So that part is missing from this. But from this period, you start to see the British long-term, and you see some documents again showing this, where they're looking at the territory, and their way of being able to do this is they come to us, they ask for it, they offer to buy it. Again, we're talking about from the Indigenous perspective, as I said, how do you own land? From our perspective, you can't, it's a living thing. We're there to take care of it. We are there to share it and utilize it without overburdening it, so that way we can continue to live it, and our 7 generations to come are there to be able to utilize it too. Following the American Revolution, you have a mass amount of land claim or a mass amount of purchases start from Niagara Falls right through most of what we would call Southern Ontario today. During this time as well, you see eventually the spread of Methodism to our community. So when we Christianize, it is with the Methodist Church. Peter Jones, who is a member of the First Nation, which is in our westernmost part of our territory, he eventually converts to Methodism after his sister convinces him to. So again, when we're talking about documentation, it is looked at as Peter Jones being the first Mississauga person to convert, but it was his sister who then convinced him to convert. So we leave out that part as well. But through that process, he then starts to convince other Mississauga to convert. And one of the reasons why he's able to do that is because he's already speaking English, he understands English. So when he is talking about books and stories, or talking about stories from the Bible, he's able to relate it to our traditional stories, our creation stories. So is very able to resonate with Mississauga people. And you start to see a quick movement on conversion and starting to take Christian names, and also looking to exist as villages in the way that Western or European structures of towns were being formed. So quickly from the 1820s on, Hiawatha, Curve Lake, Mississauga's the Credit become communities, and they are established as permanent villages with a church in them and some log houses. But during this time as well, there starts to be conflict over these purchases because it's never enough. The encroachment continues. Territory that we may have allowed for it to be sold off, it's not what they stay to. We have settlers who come into our territories and keep encroaching. They break those agreements, so there's fighting over that. And we also have alcohol used as a tool to be able to further that. And in that case, you see almost an all-out breakout of war between the Mississauga and the settlers at York, because alcohol is tried to be used to influence one chief and his wife and the chief's sister. It does not go very well, and not very long after that, the chief and his sister are killed, and his wife is injured really badly. So there is a process of almost going to war. That is prevented though. But this conflict starts to go on. Also during this time, you start to see that conflict between our traditional way of doing things versus the Methodist tradition. So you start to see a fight of our spirituality, or the way that we traditionally done spirituality, versus the way you do it through the Methodist Church. How women are looked at versus how men are looked at. What types of jobs you can do, farming rather than hunting and gathering. And during this time, you start to see a movement as well from us being allies to being from being allies and friends to being in the way of progress. You start to see that news that we're not going to survive the onslaught of progress, but that comes with the diseases and other things that will arrive. So when we're talking about the church, there's a lot of components that go alongside it here. Peter Jones, like I said, is one of the main people who gets focused on for converting. There's questions about why he did this. Peter Jones, as a young boy, almost died, almost froze to death when his father had gone on a binge with alcohol and forgot that he was outside. He almost died from that. So there's questions about how, because of that, as he self-hated and looked at that situation, meaning that represented all Indigenous people or all Native people, and therefore how we operated as people, that's what he thought. So therefore he had self-hatred toward himself, and that the proper way to go forward and the way to be civilized is obviously to follow the British. Others argue that he looked at the religion as a way of protecting us and being able to move forward. And then there's also that combination where it could be a bit of both. Some of his documents you can see where he is very much, he has his own biography, his diaries are printed. He talks about this very early on, where he's very, 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 very much staunch in his beliefs, thinks that how being British is the best way to go forward, acting like the British, talking the British language, talking and following Christianity is the way to go forward. And near the end of his life, you can start to see him being dismayed with how no matter how hard he's tried, it didn't seem to matter. And you start to see this, especially by the 1840s. By the 1840s, we're not the right Christians anymore. We're Methodists. We're not United Church of England. So you start to see the British using that as a way to undermine our territorial claims, our title to territory, because we had started to ask for this. There had been already petitions sent to Queen Victoria by this time. We were asking for recognition of the territory that we've been farming for 20 years now, because we've done it the right way, according to how the British said that we were supposed to do it. But we're not being granted it. And one of the things that is used against us is because we're not the right Christians. So during the 1840s, there's a split between the 5 communities in the South. Half of them go to the Church of England, the other half stay to the Methodists. So you have us divided as well. But again, as time goes on, and as all of the communities kind of switch over to being the Church of England, it didn't matter anymore. Because again, we're just in the way, and it becomes very clear from the documentation that it didn't matter how hard we were going to try, how hard we were going to try, and how much we tried to be like the British. It wasn't suiting their needs, because with us still in existence as it is, without being assimilated or integrated fully, we'll have claim to that territory. So we can't have our land claim or have our title recognized, because that would undermine what is wanted by our founding fathers in Canada. They were not deemed worthy to be civilization and saving. And this is why in our northernmost community, Mississauga near Sault Ste. Marie, the Catholic Church is the one that dominates up there. So we have the Methodists and the Church of England dominate in the south. The Catholic Church is the one that dominates up there. And that's very important for when we talk about residential schools up there, because they are sent to a Catholic residential school, where most of the south are sent to Anglican residential schools. Oh. And again, this goes alongside of, we have what is known as the Bachelor Commission. And I say we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, because in it, it's very clear, it has been written by the commission that it doesn't matter, we're not civilized enough, we'll never be civilized enough. No matter how hard we try, we're going to still be in the way. And so it calls for further control and tightening of our rules relating to us, and for being able to have unilateral decision-making power for us. And this starts the process that leads to eventually the Indian Act. There's also questions about how, I mentioned, a couple of communities moved. It is made to look at some cases where the community chose to move, but you can find documentation going back 20 years prior to that, where it's clear they wanted us to move. So the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation, is called that because they originally established themselves on the Credit River in the area that we call Mississauga or Port Credit now. They are moved to an area that has no access to water. They have no access to a river, which is very rare because, again, as I said, we are fisher people. We are people of we're people of the rivers, the best of the rivers. But at the same time, they were very good economically. Their land had been cleared. They were good at farming it. They had built their own naval yard to be able to actually take in and pier to be able to actually make money after that. I believe Port Credit is why it is where it is now. And so they are convinced to move from there into territory that's not actually very good. Originally, they are trying to convince to be moved somewhere else. It doesn't go very well. So they end up in their postage stamp that they have now, territory that they originally surrendered to Six Nations, members of the Haudenosaunee, when they came there in 1783. You can see again through some of this correspondence where we're saying this, like over the years, we're highlighting again that yes, we have this relationship. We have chosen to go a certain way, but that choosing to go that certain way is not necessarily helping us. It doesn't matter what we're doing. So you have a lot of people who stop farming, who give up that, go back to hunting, who go back to hunting and harvesting, because what's the point of doing anything when no matter how hard you've tried for 20 years, you're not recognized and you're not able to even have control to that territory. You have quite a few people at this time who again petitioned Queen Victoria for title to their own farmland, and they're denied. So what's the point of continuing going down that road when it's not actually helping you in any way? And this goes alongside further control that continues on. And so you see people from our communities from 1820s to 1920 petitioning, writing to British representatives, writing to the Crown, saying this is not being followed, this is not what we agreed to. Look back to the Rice Lake purchase of 1820 or 1818. Look back to the various other treaties, Gunshot Treaty, Royal Proclamation, the treaties of Niagara. You're not following your side of the agreement. You're not making sure that your settlers, your citizens, your people, your subjects aren't interfering with our life and interfering on us and encroaching on us. So this continues to impact this where we have from Canadian Confederation, where they want control. We're not at the table. The decisions in regards to our territory made by 4 colonies that we've never had a table at. We still have never been brought into federation. And the Indian Act comes in as a way of further controlling. It was assumed that we would agree and wanted to simply enfranchise into the Canadian state under British subjects. But that doesn't happen. We don't actually go that route. So it becomes law. If you want an education, if you want a degree, you are no longer allowed to be Native. If you want to go into the military, you can no longer be Native. If you want to be a doctor, you want to be a reverend, a minister, you can no longer be Native. If you want to move outside of your community, you can no longer be Native. If you marry a white man, you are no longer Native. Our original governance structures are outlawed. Our hereditary systems are outlawed. And they define who's an Indian. As I said, Section 27 of the Indian Act says I'm an Indian. This continues on until 1960, when we are allowed to be both without losing one or the other. So 1960, we become Canadian citizens, but are allowed to be citizens of our own nations. But by this time, that history and that relationship, the original nation-nation relationship, isn't fully understood by Canadians. They've not been taught it. And by this time, the issues that are facing Indigenous people up there, it's looked at as socioeconomic rather than socioeconomic and a history of colonization that still continues. So in the 1960s and 1980s, we start to see the communities, especially those 6 communities, move forward. You see development for the communities economically. We can also see this moving away from residential schools to what we call the 60 scoop. So again, those socioeconomic issues are an issue. So as I was saying earlier to someone, a single mother wants to go to get a degree at a college because she needs that degree to make better money for her kids because she can't take care of them. Well, she's not a good mother. She's not doing her motherly duties because she's trying to leave them to go to school. So her kids will get taken. But her kids are going to get taken anyways because she's not making enough money to take care of them. So she's not doing her duty as a parent. So you have a whole couple of decades of children who are taken forcibly adopted out around the world. So you have this going on alongside this. So although we see the slow progress of closing down residential schools and moving away from that, you have our child services and our child services in different provinces taking children because they're not being looked at as being taken care of. When there's a lot more that goes behind that and isn't being considered, especially when considering some of the rules not being followed properly by what we would expect them by traditional gender views. During this time, though, especially going into the 90s, you start to see resurgence. So despite all these negative things, we're still here. We've not left. We're still in our territory. We still remind them. It has been rebuilding that because, again, residential schools in our community, we could argue in a very horrible way, but it was successful. It got rid of the Indian in a lot of our people. A lot of people did not know that when they were starting to relearn. A lot of people looked at it very negatively. It is heathenistic. Why are you bothering to learn that language? How dare you? This is not going to be anything good. So you start to see resurgence in the 90s, especially amongst the Mississauga communities, 80s and 90s. Language, culture, traditions start to come back and a relearning of identity. If you asked me when I was 14 if I knew I was Mississauga, I wouldn't have known that. I knew I was Ojibwe. I didn't know I was Mississauga. When I turned 18, I planned to enfranchise and get rid of my identity because I wanted nothing to do with it. Because the way I was taught through my schooling was that was the problem, not the history that existed in that colonization. We see today with our rights being re-granted through or being re-recognized through the will and free settlement of our right to hunt and fish and harvest. You see youth returning to learn not only our language, but also about our harvesting, hunting, trapping, fishing practices that reflect how we've always done stuff. We are seeing the reestablishment of our Dodem. So when I say I'm part of the Caribou clan now, I found that out 2 years ago. I thought I was a different clan because my mom went by Wolf. She was adopted into Wolf clan. I think you went by Deer, right, Laurie? And an elder from another community corrected us very quickly on a call that we were actually Caribou. And the reason why you can relate it to, so a female Caribou is a cow. Our last name is Cowie. Our word for it is Atik. So reestablishing those Dodems are really important for going forward because it's remembering that, especially when we're looking at our history, we start to make our connection with our own families and the documents that we've signed, the treaties we've signed. And alongside this, you see a fondness and a memory in a positive way of the importance of gardens, harvesting together, sharing access to our waterways, fishing, and obtaining that wild rice and that maple sap. They're very important. Harvesting that wild rice, tapping that maple sap, doing the fishing are parts of our governance, are part of our language, are part of our education. It's all connected. Today, these are the communities that I was just talking about. This is where they are located on a map, if you're looking at Ontario. So Mississauga is way up at the north there. I've joked with some of them. I said, what did you guys know and not tell the rest of us? Because it took a while for them to have to deal with some of the stuff that we were dealing with in the south. And looking back on that, that has not necessarily been a negative thing because there's a lot of stuff we're learning from them for being protected up there. Your turn now.
Miigwech, Chairman. I'm just going to talk a little bit and we won't take much more of your time. But this is our community of Hiawatha First Nation, and this is our powwow grounds and some of our young people dancing. They are the shawl dancers, and they dance to, it's usually the young people because it is quite a dance. And their job is they look like butterflies. So there's these teachings behind every dance. There's steps to every dance. So we talk about our values, which grow from our culture, from which we are born into and live within our beliefs and attitudes emerge from our values. As Michi Saagiig peoples from the Michi Saagiig Nation, we try to live a healthy life, Manitoba through the teachings passed down from our ancestors. And when I talk about specifically to Hiawatha, we have our treaty rights, and the specific rights of Indigenous peoples have been embodied in treaties they entered into with the Crown governments. Crown governments were initially France or Britain, and then after Confederation Canada, which is a state. Existing treaty rights are protected under Section 5 of the Constitution Act, and Michi Saagiig peoples are signatory to 18 treaties from the Niagara Treaty of 1764 to the Williams Treaty of 1923. And then Hiawatha as a First Nation is specifically signatory to these treaties. So Hiawatha First Nation is located 20 kilometers southeast of Peterborough. And if you can see, and Chad mentioned Treaty 20 in his part of the presentation. But if I just go over here. So we go down, right? So Hiawatha is right in that little area. So if you consider, and I walked away from the camera, if you consider that whole, just that part of the treaty area, that's a treaty area. That's not the traditional territory we're talking about. That is one of the treaty areas. And if you see that area of how vast and how much where we traveled, where we hunted, where we lived, where we gathered, we're down to this little dot right by Rice Lake. So in 1928 or 1828, we became the Mississaugas of Rice Lake Reserve. And at that time, we had a land base of approximately 1,100 acres, 130 adults, and 90 children. And in our book, it says we boasted a store, a post office, and a schoolhouse, and a teacher's residence. Today, our community has a population of approximately 1,012 citizens, with 225 living in the community and a land base of 250 acres. What we've been doing is purchasing the land that comes up for sale around our community, so right adjacent to our community. In the last since 2018-19, we have purchased over 200 acres. And part of that is in our community, we have a housing list. And there's approximately 160 families on this list. And we have no land available at this point, no serviced land. We do have land sort of in the middle of the community that we could open up, but now we're looking at millions of dollars to open this land and have service lots. So what we're trying to do is it's called an addition to reserves process through Canada. So basically we buy our land, we give it back to Canada so they can turn it into reserved land, and then they give it back to us. This process takes, some communities have been waiting 30 years. It's and this is what we deal with regularly. So our last additions to reserve property took 12 years to come back into us, so we could use it, so we could build on it, so we could grow our community. And then we also own a convenience and gift store, gas bar. We are the caretakers of Serpent Mounds, which Chad had mentioned, and it's a designated historical site. This Serpent Mounds we had purchased it, I believe, in 1902, and we had taken care of it, and then the province, Ontario, came and they wanted to lease it. They leased it for over 50 years and ran it as a special park. And then in the late 90s, we took the park back over. And so what was happening is they were supposed to lease it, and that we weren't getting the correct lease. We took the park back over. And during that time, that's where Serpent Mounds is, and I don't know Serpent Mounds, but it's one of two mounds in North America. It is the biggest one that we're aware of. This And so it's 200 feet long and it's shaped in the shape of a serpent. It's where it comes from. And what had happened over the many years, archaeologists, Territorial would come in, especially when they ran this park, and they would dig it up. And so they were buried in these mounds. And at one point, they actually had the mounds open and glass over it, where you could look into our ancestors and bundles that buried and stop that. And it was covered back up during that time, and during archaeologists would take things from there and meaning like whether it be part of our bundles or it could have been our ancestors. We always say our ancestors. So if they took some of those bones, we have over 200 of our ancestors sitting at the Territorial Museum that repatriate them to their burial ground. So there's a lot of work that has to be done and still has to be done in order for us to take care of the mounds with the heritage, but also to take care of our ancestors. And somebody that meetings that some of the comments made, and it's to a point of I wouldn't go to a cemetery and I wouldn't dig up your ancestors and I wouldn't put them on display. I don't know why they thought that as Indigenous people, as First Nations people, we were something to be studied, and why were we so different, and why were we like it just doesn't make sense to me. And then and to be our ancestors to be mistreated like that. And then we also have, and we have lots of good things. I always say, if you're going to do story events, we have lots of good stories too. And I remember talking to the media, my dad would say, when don't talk to them because they'll twist your words or they won't say what you said and all those pieces. So I had a young man come from one of the papers and I asked him, I said, his name's Taylor. And I said, Taylor, why are you here? And not to be blunt, but why are you here? And he told me he wanted to learn more. I said, okay, I'll work with you. But if you lie, if you misinterpret anything I say, I'll speak to you again. We've had a wonderful relationship since then. And he tells the good stories. And so we also have, for some of our sources of fire and police, we have public works, we have administration, which covers a lot area that includes, director of operations, it includes lands, housing, education, and then we have health and social services. And actually, one of the ladies we brought with us is Tina, sitting there with Heidi, and she's our health and social services manager, has been there for over 20 years, like that. Does a wonderful job taking care of our community. And then we continue towards meeting the needs of our growing community through our human resources and services we can offer, and to ensure our citizens' community and safety. And then we also continue to relearn our culture and our language. And you heard me introduce myself, and what I had said was my Anishinaabe name, which is Eagle Woman. When I said my other name is, my English name is Laurie. I'm from the Hoof clan, and I am of Michi Saagiig Nation. And then we always talk about, we have to remember, and that's a lot of what you heard tonight, was to embrace our past, our present, and our future. We have our meeting. So when we talk about, here's some of the governance work that we're doing, and we're working on a custom citizenship code. Chad talked about our citizenship, and we were talking about it today with Heidi. And part of that is we're numbered. I know my number off by heart. And our children are numbered, but they're also numbered beside that. So both my parents are biological status. So I'm a 6'1", means I can pass my status. My daughter, my son, whose father is from Alderville. He's a 6'1". But my daughter, who is with my husband, who's non-native, she's a 6'2". She can't pass her status on. We're at a point right now where I don't think Canada knows how to explain it, so we try to understand their numbers. We're at like 6'1", 2'8" GM. Hang on here. What does that mean? Let us determine who our citizens are. Let us, we know who are. And so it goes to even the point of my daughter, I'm from two families, say that. I'm from two families there. My daughter, who comes from that lineage, she wouldn't be able to pass her status on if she has a child with a non-native person. But I can adopt a child that's non-native from anywhere in the world, and I can get this. So those are the pieces that are very wrong with this legislation. And then, again, it was part of trying to remove Indians, well, that's the old word, but to get rid of First Nations people. So we have a lot of work to do politically. But this is the work we're doing at home, our citizenship code, we're working on an election code. And part of that election code, Chad had also mentioned, I went to a meeting. And part of that meeting was we did an example of how a traditional government would work with the clan system. So we had the clan heads, 7 clan heads, we each had a role. So the crane, they were the leader, they were the external leader. So they would go out and they would let in the allocate. Then there was and they got into the business in the year there, and they all had their role. So we were presented with the problem. The chief, the crane, became and read the problem, and then they would all go away and we become which one I talked about the community who belonged to those clans. And you would go out of the plan and came up with, and then when you go back, did they say they would do this? Carry the water. And so the answers come, and then we go back, and this is the whole play that we did, and it was really interesting because we do work on stuff. And even in our community, or this Indiana, we still do that in our community. I think this was the council we have now, and you know, honestly, they've done very well. We haven't really had any disagreements, and if we do them right, you know, not everybody is going to agree with you, and we move on. And so we're working through a lot of pieces in the last few years. We built and it's not all about building, but we built a beautiful community center. We just had clean water for a third of our community come into our community. We've had fiber come in, so we're getting to be very progressive and do that good work, but at the same time, it's really important for us to keep up our tradition and our culture. So our young, and in our child care center, we do have the language, and we continue to learn, and I continue to learn. So I know some words, some of my language, I understand some of it, but I'm not fluent. So this is actually our vision statement. We, the Mississauga of Hiawatha First Nation, are a vibrant, proud, independent, and healthy people balanced in the richness of our culture and traditional way of life. And part of our past, present, and future, to honor and respect gifts from the Michi Saagiig women to the Prince of Wales in 1860. This is one of the baskets. We call them wigwas, which are birch bark baskets. And this is just one picture. A woman named Sarah Tonchi had made this basket, and that's the top and the side. But 13 of these baskets came home for a visit. Chad talked about gifts, and people were saying, well, why don't you have them repatriated, bring them back? And our ancestors gave them as gifts. They were stolen. So they'll go back to England. and in mid-November. But they're here for a visit. And so when we brought them in and we're working with the Royal Collections Trust, we did ceremony. They're 163 years old. And they came home after all that time. So when they came home and we opened the crates, we had to let them sit for a couple of days. And we smudged and we did ceremony. And we had a lady come from Kerr Lake and she spoke to them in the language. She was allowed to hold them. We were able to hold them. And she spoke to them in the language. And at that point, it was like we were all tearing because that's the first time they've heard the language in 63 years. All to us, those are our ancestors. Our women made those. The unique part of that we learned from Amanda, Rachel P, was that these baskets are so well taken care of because we didn't know what happened to them. And they were, the Queen Victoria had put them on display in her museum at the Isle of Wight. So they were very well taken care of as far as that English way of being in a museum and having them taken care of. So when they came home, we smashed them, we feasted them, we spoke to them in the language. And now they're at the Peterborough Museum and Archives because we don't have a museum, which is and being taken care of that way. So, you know, I think about, it was my great grandfather who was the chief at the time. He was 100 years old. And he was the one who had, that was chief when they had gifted, when the Picts came and gifted those baskets. So I often thought, I'm not a descendant of any of those make baskets, but I'm a descendant of the chief. And I often thought, what did he say? They say he said a speech, but we can't find it. But again, maybe it wasn't written. He may not have known how to write in English. So I think, what would have he said? What would have his? So for me, that was pretty emotional, and I can only imagine he would have talked about the treaty because there was letters to the Queen about the treaties and the misrepresentation that's happening with the First Nations people in Canada, and especially those with that direct relationship. So to me, this brought forward, you know, he would have talked about those treaties. He would have talked about how it was supposed to be, that relationship of sharing, that relationship of respect and honor. And that's not how it turned out to be. So it was quite interesting to and you know, it fills your heart with joy and some sadness and then just, you know, amazing. And to see these baskets, and that's the color, those are the colors that's still in them for 63 years old. So they were well taken care of, and now they're home for a while. And yeah, we have the pleasure of doing what we need to do with them. And so in our conclusion, we just want to say the Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg means the people that live at the mouths of rivers. Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg is used to describe our people in the notes of Treaty of 1701 in Montreal, and appears on a map done by British cartographers in the 1700s, and it's used to the journals of the Jesuits. And this is the book, and I can send some, Heidi. I will send some of Doug's books to you, or perhaps I'll bring them. But Doug Williams, he has passed on, and he wrote a book with really great history in it. And so we just want to say Finigwech, thank you. I know I'm guessing we're for an hour. But here is our contact information, and I know Heidi knows how to reach me. And, you know, Chimigwech, big thank you to all of you for sitting through and learning and having us here. We're grateful and honored to be here. Miigwech.
Just probably that I want to also say Miigwech and say Miigwech to Carr and the community for asking me to come down and help with giving this discussion. This is my Mississauga Nation email. If you go to the University of Toronto website and type in my name, you'll find my U of T email. That will probably be the best one to use, but I'll make sure it's also passed along so it can be posted if you need to contact or want to contact me regarding anything. That is more than welcome. Now, going through this history, got a crash course in about 400 years, 500 years, and this period of time. So thank you for listening to us again, Miigwech. And again, it's important for me to understanding that history moving forward, because if we're going to move forward on a good path, we have to be able to understand where we're coming from, and to do that together, we need to understand each other. So go ahead.
Well, let's all hear a round of applause first. That was fascinating. And if I should give a hand. I mean, I'm amazed at the depth of research you've been doing, and it was really very, very fascinating and amazing that you came to do this presentation for us. I want to give a chance for, I'm looking at my phone. I don't know if there's any questions on the Zoom. No questions on the Zoom. Any questions in the room? Yes. So the question is, how is it your experience in Canada compared to some of the experience on this side of the border? I don't know who wants to take that question.
And then because you've actually talked, I'll talk with this from the academic side and then I'll go to the politician. So on my side, from what we've seen, it depends on a few things. The way the United States approach has been very different than how Canada has, and how it has been done on the ground. But if we're looking at relations, obviously the nations that are on this side of the lake are shown. So originally they were not our friends, but there is overlap. So we look at the background what led to this whole conversation happening. I know there's questions about, well, why is this Saga man down? We don't have this man who's the Saga, but they have white is there. And traditionally, my theory so far, and there's no, I have no, but his wife is probably the so there wasn't in there, there may be Iroquois society, so the children would have their land, would have connection to the territory. And especially after the American Revolution, there is intermarriage happening with the Haudenosaunee Nation alongside the Mississauga and the other Anishinaabe members of the nation. So there is an overlapping relationship. We have longstanding treaties, relationships, whether bad or good, with the other nations on this side, including the nations from the other New England states who are part of the Wabanaki Confederacy, and the Sioux out in the prairies to an extent, the Huron obviously as well. With the United States, our relationship mainly came through fighting on the French side during the 7 Years' War and supporting the British during the Revolution, and then obviously supporting the British again during the War of 1812. So there's symbolism for why our word, when you translate it in English for the Americans, is the people with the big knives and why it's called Big Knife Country. So I almost want to think it's because that's something else for them, but I don't know. So there's more unpacking that needs to go on there. And just from being here today and talking up in Sax Harbor, there's some information there that will be that's been passed along, and books that I actually got up there that will be interesting to dissect and see where that is, and potentially connections with the Oneida community that's near Syracuse and so on, because I'm wondering if they have on their records a Mississauga man. So I'm trying to see what the connection there as well. You talked to the chiefs down here?
I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure how it is in regards politically. I was just at Harvard doing a tribal leadership program June, and one of the tribes, I always say First Nation, but one of the tribes from California was working with Harvard, and they had put on this first tribal leadership program, and so dependent First Nations leaders from Canada was selected to go, and was lucky enough to have this opportunity. But what I found there in the morning, we gathered at 7:30, we had these groups before class day, and in talking, I was the only leader from the Canada side. And what I found interesting is it was, our issues could be similar, very similar, when it was a citizenship and it was about the land. I think the issues are similar, very much so, but how they're handled is. And so, at points I was
that, and we would talk forth and talk about, well, how did you do this work? Like, how did that piece work? And, you know, there was honestly points where I'm like, oh, yeah. And so to me, that's really saying, you know, because when we know what we have and how it is the American government with the First Nations people here. And so there's, you know, I think it's that time, right? When we talk about doctrine and discovery, and we talk about those pieces and how even before treaties, even before all those pieces, you know, it just, if you study from there, you research from there, and you look, you see, you know, it always is our land, right? It's always is our take this. So how do we get rid of those, you know, people, right? How we take their language, we take their children, take their culture, take their thing. And so yeah, very simple, but obviously the race is different. And one of the ladies, and he's talking about how, and I'm thinking it's 2023. How did your community not even know? How did you not have water? So, you know, again, similar. And earlier when we were talking about clean water, my home, I built my house 31 years ago. Just within this was I was 20 minutes, 15 minutes. And so it's those pieces that we talk about in our 2023, Canada or the US. Put in millions and millions and billions of dollars to build a pipeline. And our people can't clean. So, you know, just also, yeah, very similar.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Maybe. But
So the question is about the UN Declaration of Rights.
The political science response, the optimistic, pessimistic, or realistic, which one? So UN DRIP, as it's also referred to by its abbreviation, is obviously an agreement that was worked on probably 30 years amongst Indigenous people at the UN. So we're talking about the rest of the world, we're talking about over 14,000 different Indigenous nations. So that's North America or South America or Australia. There are Indigenous groups that exist across the world. I knew in Japan, and then obviously when we look at a map of Africa, you have 57 countries carved up from outsiders telling them to do this. That represents over 150 different actual groups of people. So UN group was a way of looking at trying to recognize and protect those Indigenous rights, especially with some of the wrongs that have been done by some of the empires. So when it was voted on, obviously the United States said no at first. So did Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the four of them that actually are birthed out of that colonization. And it's not the Indigenous people from those territories that are in control. So there's a lot of questions about that. Canada eventually signed on, and there's a lot of things that go alongside of this that are really important. So when Canada finally agreed to it after the 2015 election, we had a change in government, and we went from not supporting it to now we will support to implement it. It's not implemented yet, because when we're talking about this, there are components of it that require Canadian law to be adjusted and changed. But there are parts of Canadian law that are not feasible with UN DRIP because it goes against some of those laws that exist. So you'd have to dismantle that. To dismantle that, you have to get the provinces to agree. And on top of that, when you look at some UN agreements, because of how our confederation works as the Canadian state, there's sometimes what's called the Canada clause. So Canada can say, yes, we're going to support this, such as UN DRIP. But if it falls into provincial jurisdiction, they don't have to. So Canada can support it, but they get out of having to force it on. They have to get out of having to put it into place because it's a provincial jurisdiction and it's not their job to make the province put it into place. That's the province's job. So there's conflict there that exists. And again, we're talking about we're talking about again, that relationship down here, that border is part of probably the long-standing relationship we have with the states because our traditional territories are on both sides, not the Mississauga Confederacy that we're a part of. It goes on to both sides. So we also have provincial jurisdictions that play into that confederacy. So, and multiple different treaties. So there's hope there. Some people have hope, especially areas that are not treaty. So a lot of British Columbia, the territories, parts of Quebec have never had a treaty done. So by the way that it's been kind of ruled, it could be considered illegal. So they try to fix that by making other treaties now. But so there's hope from there because there's a way of negotiating this of how to go forward. But there is confusion of how to interact it or put it into place with those of us who already have treaties in place, multiple treaties that haven't been followed, especially when it comes to land rights and resource rights, which are provincial jurisdiction. So there's hope. It's nice with what it says, but we're still waiting to see how it gets put into place in the process. And that depends on political will, different political government or the different parties that come into govern, depending on the province or the federal government as well. So sorry, I gave you the science answer.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, if there's no other questions, and I don't believe there's any in the Zoom, we will conclude. It's warm in here and everyone wants to get some fresh air. But again, let's do one more round of applause. It's wonderful. And thank you. And everyone have a great night. And this will be on our YouTube channel again. Share it with friends. Thank you.
Right.